In a microsecond, the world dissolved into chaos. The ice-covered slope fractured beneath Colby Coombs' crampons with a distinct, hollow crack. Before he could shout a warning, tons of rushing snow and ice ripped him from the mountain face. The sound was unlike anything he had ever heard, a roaring thunder that drowned all thought. An avalanche. Tumbling helplessly down the slope, Colby's body absorbed impact after brutal impact. The mountain's vengeance was swift and merciless. In those fractions of seconds, as he plummeted nearly 800 vertical feet, all certainty vanished. All control surrendered. The three climbers, bound together by two ropes in the traditional Alpine style, disappeared into the void. On June 15, 1992, the bright red Cessna coasted to a bumpy stop on the sprawling Kohiltna Glacier, 7,200 feet above sea level. Tom Walter approached Colby Coombs and Rit Kellogg with troubling news. After surveying their intended route from the air, he warned them the ridge was in terrible shape, possibly from earthquake damage, and recommended they abandon their plan. The trio had originally planned to make the first ascent of an unnamed ridge on Mount Hunter. Tom's assessment was sobering but welcome. None wanted to take foolish chances. Already, the 1992 climbing season had claimed 11 lives on Mount McKinley alone, an all-time high. Colby suggested Mount Foraker instead, pointing to the imposing 17,400-foot peak rising directly across the glacier. Tom confirmed there was an established route called the Pink Panther on the southeast ridge, a challenging but manageable mile of nearly vertical climbing that would likely take 5 or 6 days in decent weather. With their decision made, the climbers spent the next day sorting gear and preparing supplies. By 6 o'clock on June 16th, they were ready. The men clamped on skis, roped themselves together to minimize crevasse danger, and set out across the 5-mile-wide glacier. Colby pulled a child's red plastic sled loaded with a week's worth of food and stove fuel. Annie Duquette watched the three climbers from her position as air traffic controller and base camp manager. 10 climbing seasons on the glacier had given her a sixth sense. These men struck her as capable alpinists, strong, confident, well-prepared. Yet something prompted her to watch them longer than usual as they set off toward Mount Foraker that evening. Next morning, they made rapid progress up the lower reaches of the mountain. The small party had reached Foraker's base by 11 o'clock the previous night and immediately began climbing. Using ice axes and crampons, they moved efficiently up the lower reaches. By the end of their first full day on the route, they had covered nearly a third of the total distance. Excitement fueled their progress. Tom, the veteran alpinist with an impressive resume of climbs in Pakistan, India, Nepal, and South America, set a measured pace. Colby and Rit followed, their friendship forged through years of shared adventures since meeting at Colorado College in 1986. Then the clouds gathered. Snow fell in discouraging abundance. They dug a snow cave into the slope and waited out the storm. Inside their cramped shelter, the men joked about their situation. The sky cleared the following day. The trio prepared to tackle the most technical section, 1,000 feet of high and treacherous rock buttress coated with thin, unstable layers of ice. Tom and Colby swapped leads as they climbed. Rit was content to let the others set the pace. They moved slowly but steadily, employing their full mountaineering repertoire. By midnight, they reached the top of the buttress. The men had been climbing nonstop for about 12 hours, but their relief was short-lived. Before them lay a 1,200-foot ice slope rising at a 50-degree angle. Visibility had dropped to near zero. Wind gusted at 40 miles per hour. Death from exposure became a real possibility. After a brief discussion, they decided to push over the slope rather than attempt to make camp in such exposed conditions. With plenty of food and fuel, they could wait out the worst of the storm once they reached a protected location. Colby led the way up the ice slope. Ritt followed in the middle position. Tom brought up the rear. They were roped together in standard Alpine configuration. The wind screamed around them, forcing Colby to stop frequently to clear his goggles of blowing snow. Approximately 100 feet up the slope, he noticed something alarming. The snow beneath his crampons was fracturing, a crack forming in the snowpack. He was about to shout a warning when the world disintegrated. The cloud-shrouded ice slope transformed into a chaotic maelstrom. A wall of ice and snow smashed into him with such force that he hurtled down the slope like a flipped-over turtle. Tons of mountain debris pummeled the three climbers, separating them despite their rope connections. The force was irresistible. The noise overwhelmed all senses. Blackness followed. Next morning, on June 19th, Colby's eyes fluttered open to the harsh, unforgiving brilliance of an Alaskan dawn. Waves of agony pulsed through every fiber of his being. The bitter cold had invaded his core, turning his marrow to ice. His fingers, protected only by paper-thin glove liners, had lost all sensation. His vital outer mittens were nowhere to be found. The avalanche, the fall. He was alive. But what of the others? Using an ice tool, Colby edged clumsily over to where Tom lay. His movements were slow and agonizing. When he reached his friend, Colby could see Tom's body was cold and stiff. No pulse. When he turned him, Tom's face was covered completely by a hard mask of opaque white ice frozen onto his skin. The effect was eerie, as if Tom's identity had been taken along with his life. Below the body, a bloody streak stained the frozen slope as far as he could see. Tom Walter was dead at 11,200 feet on Mount Foraker. Grief threatened to overwhelm Colby. Then training kicked in. He would have to focus or never survive. Colby removed Tom's right mitten with its shell and liner. He put the shell backward on his left hand and the liner on his right. Next, he took Tom's pack and the ice screws hanging from a sling around his neck. Resources for survival. He needed to cut the rope to free himself. Using a knife from his bibs, he began sawing through the line. As soon as Colby severed the line, Tom's body dropped away, rocketing down the mountain and disappearing over the edge, gone in seconds. The reality was stark. If he weren't careful, he might follow Tom into the abyss. But where was Ritt? Looking down, Colby could see the white line descending below him. He called out for Ritt several times, but only the wind answered. After recovering some strength on a small ledge, Colby saw his friend's body about 30 feet below. He carefully made his way down. Being next to Ritt's body, Colby felt horror and sadness sweep over him. Forcing himself to focus, he retrieved a half-full water bottle from Ritt's pack, gulping down the contents. Next came the tent, stove, fuel, and food. When he had what he needed, Colby removed an ice tool from Ritt's pack, drove it into the icy slope, and tied his friend's body to it for search parties to find. Now he had to plan. His head pounded. His left shoulder was certainly fractured. His left ankle could barely bear weight. What was the fastest route off this mountain? Early next morning on June 20th, Colby's first steps were excruciating. Could his damaged ankle withstand the stress of climbing? After experimentation, he found his ankle could bear weight if he held his foot at a right angle and moved with a sideways step. It was slow progress, but he was moving. The difference this time was stark. He wasn't climbing for the thrill, but for his life. His mother's face became his focal point. After his father left when Colby was a child, she had raised him and his two sisters alone. Disappearing without a word to her was unacceptable. Pain radiated through his body with each movement. His broken shoulder throbbed. His neck sent shooting pains with the slightest turn. Sleep came in brief, tormented intervals. When he tried to sit up to take a drink of water, the pain in his neck was so bad that he realized he would have to learn to sit up all over again. Through experimentation, he found that if he grabbed his hair with one hand, taking weight off his neck, he could rock himself up into a sitting position by the 5th or 6th try. Every action required new learning. Every movement demanded calculation. On June 21st, 7 days after the expedition began, Colby finally reached the shoulder of the southeast ridge. His energy spent, he rested on a small, flat platform. From here, it was 4,000 feet down an ice-covered ridge to the glacier and camp. To battle dehydration, he consumed mug after mug of hot water and soup. Despite his exhaustion, sleep would not come. Below, he could actually make out Cessnas landing on the glacier airstrip 6 miles away. Down there, climbers went about their daily routines. No life-or-death struggle. No tragedy. He considered waiting for rescue. But the idea was fantasy. He was virtually invisible on Foraker's massive flank. No one knew his location or condition. By the next morning, Colby was weaker. The pain, minimal food, and sleepless nights were taking their toll. After a mug of his last remaining oatmeal, he resumed his descent. The route he faced was a nightmare. A series of small cliffs, drop-offs, and jumbled sections of glaciers. Some required negotiating by rope and rappelling. Colby would have to do it all with severe injuries, using only the frayed line that had bound him to Rit. Moving carefully, he came upon dozens of avalanche chutes where years of ice debris had carved icy bowling alleys into the slope. On either side of each chute was a low ridge of debris. Agonizingly, Colby climbed over each ridge, down into the chute, across the treacherous ice, and up the other side. Progress was measured in yards per hour. Then disaster nearly struck again. Colby stepped into one of the last chutes, and his right boot slipped. In an instant, he fell and began skidding down the slick ice toward a 1,000-foot drop to the glacier below. Instinctively, he slammed his axe into the ice and rolled on top of it, hoping his weight would drive the blade deeper. Screaming to himself, "Stop! Stop! Stop!" The rough textured ice skipped underneath him at a frightening speed, accelerating with each passing second. The abyss was only moments away. Suddenly the axe caught. Colby's skid stopped with a jarring jolt. The force racked his body. It felt as if his fractured shoulder blade had ripped apart. The pain was so strong he feared losing consciousness. Minutes passed while he recovered his composure. Slowly he rose to his feet, trembling with relief. How many more close calls would this mountain allow? At the end of the traverse, Colby faced a sheer 70-foot drop. He would have to rappel. He twisted an ice screw into place, rigged the line, it barely reached the ground, and descended slowly. Once down, he tried to retrieve his frayed rope by pulling on one end. It jammed. He pulled again as hard as he could, but the rope wouldn't budge. He yanked on the other end, nothing. The rope had become snared around the ice screw, and would not come loose. The only way to free it was to climb back up and untangle the line. He lacked the strength. He stood there futilely staring at the rope, realizing he would have to abandon it. From that point forward, he would have to descend without the security of a rope. Depending on what lay ahead, that might prove impossible or deadly. On June 23rd, after a restless night, Colby began walking down a shallow slope that he guessed would lead to the glacier. Halfway across, he heard a muffled whoomp, the sound every mountaineer dreads. He froze as the whole slope sank beneath his feet. Cracks radiated everywhere around him. He had triggered a slab avalanche, a whole field of unstable snow ready to slide. Colby stood absolutely still. Walking across the slope could trigger the avalanche, so continuing was not an option. He would have to climb all the way back up and find a different route down. The morning's effort had been wasted. Yet he knew he'd been lucky. Turning uphill, he slowly retraced his steps to start again. By evening, Colby found himself on relatively flat ice. He had made it off the mountain proper and onto the Glacier. 5 days of the hardest physical work he had ever endured had left him hollow. In just an hour, he reached the place where he, Tom, and Rit had stashed their skis. He could hear Cessnas descending to land at the distant airstrip. One final obstacle remained: crossing the glacier to base camp. Hidden under the snowy cover were hundreds of crevasses that could swallow him without a trace. The most awful irony would be to die within sight of safety. The diffuse evening light of the midnight sun shone on him. A solitary figure moving slowly against the backdrop of the Alaska range, hauling a red plastic sled loaded with some of his friend's gear. He stabbed at the ground with his ski poles every step of the way, testing for fragile snow bridges. Several times the sled turned over and began sliding into a crevasse, threatening to pull him with it. How much more could his body endure? Next morning, on June 24th, finally, base camp lay ahead. Trudging closer, Colby saw climbers setting up their tents. He felt like a man with a terrible secret. He skied past them in silence. Soon he came to Tom's red tent, which they'd left standing when they departed for Foraker. Exhausted beyond comprehension, he collapsed inside. Hours later, there was a knock on Annie Duquette's door. She opened it, smiling. Then she took one look at the ravaged figure before her, and her expression changed. She recognized him as one of the 3 she'd seen set off for Foraker 10 days earlier. Annie asked what happened and where the others were. All the emotion Colby had bottled up throughout his ordeal suddenly released. His throat tightened as tears welled. Finally, he managed the awful words, "They're not coming back." At the Anchorage Regional Hospital, X-rays and CAT scans revealed the full extent of Colby's injuries: a fractured shoulder blade, a broken ankle, and dangerous fractures in his vertebrae. He had descended Mount Foraker with a broken neck. The medical staff was astounded. His survival defied explanation. The bodies of Rit Kellogg and Tom Walter were never recovered from Mount Foraker. The Pink Panther route on Mount Foraker remains rarely attempted. The mountain keeps its secrets and its victims. Colby Coombs' solo descent of Mount Foraker is regarded as one of the great feats of modern mountaineering survival. Today, he works as a guide on Denali and teaches at the Alaska Mountaineering School in Talkeetna. Thank you so much for watching. We really appreciate your time and hope you enjoyed the video. If you liked what you saw, be sure to check out the other great content on our channel. Your support means the world to us, and we can't wait to bring you more. Thank you again, and see you in the next video.